Welcome, everyone. This is the last event in BAD Online International Crime Writers Festival for 2022, and we're really looking forward to this last event. My name's Catherine Dupelou-Menager, and I'm the Artistic Director of BAD Sydney Crime Writers Festival. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. We recognise...
Sorry, Catherine. Can you be careful of that piece of paper?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
I don't quite know why. Anyway, apologise. I'll start again. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. We recognise their continuing connection to land, to waters and to culture, and pay our respects to elders past and present. So we've had a great month of June, and we're ending today in true style with Mick Herron. I'm assuming everybody knows Mick's Slough House world, or perhaps you've encountered Jackson Lamb on television for the first time, or perhaps you're just like me and a complete devotee. You have a huge treat in store, whoever you are and why ever you're here. Mick is going to talk about his latest book, Bad Actors, and that the world of Slow Horses is engrossing. It's poetic, it's political, it's kind of everything, really. Now, Kate Evans is introducing Mick. Everybody in Australia who's ever listened to Radio National probably knows Kate. She is with Cassie McCullough, she's the host of The Bookshelf, and she's that wonderful person, somebody who likes genre fiction, as it is known, as well as literary fiction, which makes her completely perfect in my view. Before we start the interview, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the City of Sydney, Create New South Wales, and the State Library of New South Wales. We couldn't be doing anything without them. We also have a relationship with Booktopia, and we appreciate their support. There'll be a link on your screen, which means you can click on it and go and buy the books straight away. There it is. So just what's going to happen today, I'm going to be quiet in a moment. I'm going to leave Kate to introduce Mick, and then we'll dive into the conversation. I'll come back really briefly at the end. And finally, welcome to all our BAD listeners. We have people listening in libraries across the state, Mick, as well as people listening from home. It's always really good to do that. And also we're extended to Brisbane, which is very exciting. We've crossed the border into Queensland. So over to you, Kate, and settle in everyone for a wonderful hour.
Thanks so much, Catherine. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I speak, and I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, which is in the inner west of Sydney, which means if we're really lucky, you might just hear some planes go overhead because I do live under the flight path. As Catherine said, my name's Kate Evans. I present The Bookshelf every week on ABC Radio National, and it's a podcast too. And I'm delighted to be here with novelist, short story writer and poet Mick Herron, a writer whose books include the Zoe Berm thriller series, 7 standalone novels, and the 8 so far Slough House thrillers. And we're going to concentrate tonight on those so-called slow horses of Slough House. And the latest in the series is Bad Actors. Mick Herron, hello.
Hello, Kate.
Now, in this series, what you're asking us to do is step through a particular door near a closed Chinese restaurant in London with the wind swirling rubbish around your ankles. And I quote, because anyone intent on entry must take the stage door Johnny route, down the adjacent alley, past the overflowing wheelie bins and the near solid stench from the drains, through the door that sticks in all seasons, and then once inside, climb stairs whose carpet has worn thin as an actor's ego, and whose walls boast mildew stains, and whose light bulbs are naked and or spent. And the role of the slow horses, as this troupe is known, is to embrace unfulfillment and boredom, to look back in disappointment. So that's both poetic and funny, I think. So who are these slow horses?
Well, the slow horses are those whose careers have led them nowhere, really. They're all, they joined the intelligence service or the security services in the UK. I kind of blur the distinction between MI5 and MI6 because I'm not very interested in being accurate in my portrayal. And they've messed their careers up for one reason or another, either through incompetence or through personal issues of one sort or another, whether it's alcohol or drug dependency or anger management, gambling addictions, or they've simply fallen foul of the wrong people, and for political reasons they've been deemed no longer fit for purpose. And Slough House is where they get sent. It's an imaginary department of the intelligence service, and it's where those who have messed up their careers get sent in order to do a whole load of mundane, boring tasks. Essentially, the idea is that they will be bored into submission and they will quit and cease being a nuisance, rather than make a fuss about their situation and possibly end up in an employment tribunal. Whether that would really happen or not, I have no idea, but it was a useful hook on which to hang the series.
So why did you decide to do that, though? I mean, was it an interest in spy and espionage, or an interest in failures and downtroddens and things that go wrong? I mean, why choose that sort of tawdry, broken end of spying and espionage?
Oh, very much the latter. I'm interested in writing about failure and about people who've been thwarted and frustrated in their professional careers, but also in their lives. I mean, with my characters, it shades over. None of them are having successful home lives while their professional career fell apart. You know, they're all people who have hit brick walls of one sort or another. This, to me, is just more interesting to write about than success. I mean, I don't want to write about rich, happy people having perfect lives. It's not something that interests me. People who, you know, there are outlets for people who do want to read that. You know, they can read Hello magazine or whatever. But in creating characters, allowing them to be unfulfilled gives me a way into them. It gives me a route into their deeper selves, into their hearts and their secrets, in a way that success wouldn't allow, I don't think. Happiness writes white, is the old saying, and you know, sadness, there's more depth to it.
How important is place to your imagination, though? I mean, this forgotten, uncomfortable, grotty office building. How important is that to this series?
It's become more important as the series has gone on. And Slough House itself, I mean, doesn't exist as an entity, but the building in which I placed it, in which I've imagined this happening, is real. I used to work in London. I would commute from Oxford, where I live, and get the tube towards the east end of London, and emerge at Barbican Station. And Slough House, as I've dubbed it, is just near Barbican Tube Station. And if you come out of Barbican Tube Station, turn left and walk down, you'll go straight past it. And I don't know why this building started to interest me so much, but I knew I was going to use it as a location, initially just for a scene, perhaps. But it, as my plan for the original book, Slow Horses, took off, it became the centre of it, and it's become where I've, in a sense, I've lived ever since. It's where where most of my imagination resides these days. So far more important than I ever imagined it would be, and that's been very useful. I mean, giving the Slow Horses a kind of locus like that roots them, and it allows me a way into every book, into every new plot. There's always I always go through the same door you were talking about, even though it doesn't actually open. I have to go around the back like everybody else.
But as we enter that building and go up the stairs, and there are these offices full of, I mean, all of the books have a sort of ensemble cast. And it often takes a while in your novels before the character of Jackson Lamb shuffles into view. Although sometimes he shuffles and sometimes he almost springs, like, I don't know, a lion or an enraged buffalo or something.
Very fat panther.
You're very fat panther, but fast and surprising and dangerous, I guess. In this latest book, somebody says Jackson Lamb was extreme weather on his best days. So whether that storm for us, introduce us to Jackson Lamb.
Well, Lamb is the boss of Slough House, and his main role there is to make sure everybody's really unhappy. And he does that, I think, quite well, because he's a deeply offensive person. He's very needling. He knows how to attack the weak points, everybody's weak points. And he's the character, generally when I'm writing, I write from the point of view of the main protagonist in any given scene. And that's my way of exploring their thoughts and their feelings. With Lamb, I keep him at some distance. I keep him at hand's length, and I don't explain what he's thinking at any given time or feeling. Maybe once or twice in the early books, but I soon realized that was a bad idea. Because if readers knew that he meant everything he said, you know, and that his offensiveness was serious, then he would be intolerable. There's no way anybody could have any kind of sympathy with him or feelings for him at all. Conversely, if readers knew that he was, you know, just kidding, then he would cease to have any kind of danger to him at all. So I keep him at arm's length in order to allow him that kind of enigmatic air, if you like. Well, it's not really enigmatic, it's a lot blunter than that. To keep him away from very close inspection, just so he can maintain that aura of what's he going to do next, what's he really thinking, what's he feeling. Well, it's in many ways, as a writer, it's much easier to create a kind of mysterious character than it is to create a fully developed one. You know, if you keep a lot of a character hidden, then, you know, with careful handling, he can be someone that he or she can be someone that readers can become really intrigued by.
Yes, while he's also farting and smoking and playing games with people's lives and, as you say, needling them.
Well, he's very much a self-portrait, so yeah.
Hardly. But it's hard not to admire him too, which I think is interesting. Where does his moral compass point, do you think?
I've always been very clear that he doesn't have a heart of gold, but he does have a moral code. And what I find interesting in creating the novels is getting him to that point where the moral code is broached, so it forces him to action of some sort. I like to think of him as a shop floor worker who's been promoted to management, but his heart isn't really in management at all. He refers to his crew, or at least to agents who are actually doing the work, the shop level, if you like, as Joes, and he regards them as being of primary importance in the work that the intelligence service does, whereas those who run the intelligence service tend to think that the people in suits sitting behind desks are the most important. It's like any big organization in that way. The people doing the actual work are often regarded by those running the company as the least important aspect of the organization. So Lamb's moral code is brought into play whenever the workers, you know, the Joes, are actually under threat, and he regards their protection as being his prime motivation, his main driver. But by and large, he prefers his own Joes just to be sitting at the desks, being bored, rigid, and not doing anything. And that you know, when that's happening, he can just sit with his feet up and carry on sort of smoking, drinking, and farting, as you say.
I'm interested that you said he doesn't, you're very clear he doesn't have a heart of gold. And if this was a conventional narrative, if that's what you were writing, he would be shown to have a heart of gold. And it's sort of nice that he doesn't. But the other thing that a conventional version of the narrative would do is to have a bunch of misfits who, despite themselves, decide to work together as a team. And that sort of happens, but it doesn't quite, does it? Because there are always this bunch of really interesting characters in each book. I mean, some of them remain with us and then new characters come in. I mean, like Khan in this latest book. When we meet her, we discovered that Jackson Lamb had broken her arm.
She has a very brief and unnamed appearance in the previous novel, in Slough House. So I thought I'd bring her in and have some proper fun with her. Yeah, I think the general trope in situations like that is that you know, the bunch of losers will realize that if they act together, they can be, you know, a stronger force, and that does happen occasionally, but it doesn't have any kind of lasting impact because the characters all continue to have their own motivations and their own agendas. Essentially, they all want to get out of Slough House and back to Regent's Park, which is my name for the main part of the intelligence service. That's not going to happen, and they get told repeatedly that that's not going to happen. But nevertheless, they all believe that they will be the single exception to that. So working together is, in a sense, against their own best interests, because they know they're not, you know, as a group, ever going to achieve that kind of redemption. So there's always the selfish motivator for each of them individually, which prevents the complete, you know, cooperation that are coming into play. But they do, you know, there are evolving relationships within the group. You know, I pair them off occasionally in different sorts of ways, not generally romantically, and they form alliances, and some of them are never very popular, and others are more so.
Well, and Roddy Ho is a really interesting character, I think. He's a computer nerd and a fantasist. I mean, he seems to be playing a role in his own dramas and his own, I don't know, superhero films of his own life. Describe him.
Roddy is a character completely lacking in self-awareness, and he's one that's proved very popular with readers, which is it's strange. It's one of those things that literature can do, because he's written, I hope, with empathy. When I'm writing the Roddy House scenes, in which, as you say, he imagines that he is not only the hero, but a hero for all time. He thinks he's a completely wonderful person, and as long as I'm writing those scenes, I'm effectively being him. So I have a great deal of sympathy for his point of view while I'm writing from his point of view, because he genuinely believes what he's talking about. Or at least there's a very slight hint sometimes that he knows he's maybe a bit off the beam, but he suppresses those kind of feelings. And I think that because I present his character as being as if it were me, that allows readers to empathize with him as well. He'd be a totally intolerable person to know and to spend any time in his company. But given that readers are in his head as much as I am when they're reading those scenes, then they can sympathize with him. And he seems to be the favorite character of many of my readers.
Oh, isn't that interesting? Because he also plays an interesting role, given how much in contemporary crime fiction, there's a whole lot of things that need to be dealt with in terms of the world of the internet. And often that's too glib or too easy. And so by making him a real character who has so many character flaws while he's able to explore the world of the internet, I think that makes him more interesting. And then there's also what he does when we get to some sort of action scenes, but I want to get to that one a bit later. Look, it's hard to talk plot when you're discussing thrillers, both because we don't want to give it away and because, frankly, they're so convoluted and exciting that the thrill of reading it is trying to work out what's going on. But there are a couple of things that I thought maybe we could talk about in a broad sense. There's all the English political machinations that are fascinating, run-ins with Russia, and then the internal politics of MI5 that always plays a part in your books. So in Bad Actors, what would you say is at stake?
What is at stake?
Yeah, what's at stake?
Generally speaking, in the plots, there are sort of two central things going on. One is whatever the main part of the plot is, whether it's triggered by, say, the Novichok poisonings in Salisbury, as the novel Slough House is, or about sleeper agents embedded in British society, as Dead Lions is. And also there's what's going on in Slough House, which is essentially much more parochial, but also acted upon by Regent's Park, by the next level up, or several levels up in the hierarchy of the intelligence service. When I approach how the intelligence service works, I simply bring my own experience, not as a spy. I've never worked for the intelligence service, but as somebody who's worked in an office for an organization that got larger and larger as it was bought up and merged with other companies. What I took away from my day job experience was that the larger an organization gets, the more dysfunctional it becomes. And I simply applied that to the way that the intelligence service operates, assuming that whatever the nature of an organization, if it's run by human beings, those human beings will have their own agendas, they'll have their own motivations, they'll have their own ambitions, which won't necessarily chime in with the larger aims of the organization in question. And so that allows me to have a lot of fun with ideas of bureaucracy gone mad and middle management getting above itself and attempting internal power coups at the same time as trying to function properly as a larger organization. So the character of Diana Taverner, who is in most of the books, in all of the books, I think, is one I found very interesting because she is someone who starts off in the very first book as slightly lower down in the organization, genuinely believing that she ought to be running it because she's the best person for the job. Now, there's a slight irony in there that I also believe she's the best person for the job and she ought to be running the intelligence service. But in order to achieve that position, she has to do all sorts of underhand things, which involve getting rid of the people who are currently above her in the hierarchy. So there's that sort of ambition meets pragmatism, which I think any organization, you'll find characters a bit like that. And it's probably true that, as I say, the intelligence service is run by human beings, so there's bound to be strange individuals working for it. And in terms of the other parts of the plot, where we have the Russian elements, for instance, or the bigger political machinations going on in Westminster and so on. I increasingly find that I'm relying on the real world to provide the humour, and particularly the farce and the idiocy that I inject into the books. Anybody who pays much attention to what's going on in Westminster over the past couple of years will know that I can't invent anything quite as stupid as what really goes on every day.
And
a couple of weeks
boy,
ago,
do you have fun with that. Now,
well, it would be hard not to. It would be hard not to. Much of the time, I feel that we're being treated with, the British public are being treated with contempt by the government. So I do try to, repay that compliment. I don't have a lot of respect for our leaders.
Well, look, here's just one quote. So from your latest book. So the bad guy in this book is Sparrow. Here's a description of him. Sparrow wasn't as, and he also is the advisor to the Prime Minister. Sparrow wasn't as high profile as his predecessor had been. It would have been challenging to maintain that level of unpopularity without barbecuing an infant on television. But those in the know recognised him as a homegrown Napoleon, nasty, British and short, which was both funny, and I was struck by how often I was thinking about what I did know about British politics, which included the British Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, a previous Chief Minister of your Prime Minister. And so in asking you what was at stake, I was curious about England's libel laws, because in the first in this series, in Slow Horses, published in 2010, there's a politician in it who went to a posh school, has floppy blonde hair, rides a bike, is publicly affable and privately ruthless. He actually kills off a journalist. And then in Bad Actors, there's this political advisor. So I'm wondering how you get away with it.
I don't believe I ever describe his hair as blonde. I'm pretty sure.
Oh, okay, no, probably just floppy. I could see you looking slightly uncomfortable. No, so any connection to any politician is just, it's all in my imagination. I just saw
all
those
in your
connections.
Imagination, really. It's what you're bringing to the book. When I created that character, Peter Judd, back in 2008, I started writing that book. What I was doing was creating, gathering a collection of all the worst possible attributes that a politician could have. I mean, it was all about
look what's happened.
Self-serving and ambitious and ruthless and sociopathic, essentially. And for some reason, everybody identifies it as one particular politician that we do actually have. I mean, why that happens is absolutely beyond me.
Well, and they're political advisors. I mean, I figured that there were people who I was associating these characters with, reading from Australia, and I imagine for an English audience, there'll be a whole lot of different resonances that we would be missing. But if we can just get back to your fictional world, you talked about Diana Taverner, who is the first desk in MI5 in this latest novel. She and Jackson Lamb have a really complicated relationship. And at one point, she tried to use, in this latest book, she tried to use Lamb for her own purposes. And it sort of backfired. And she thinks to herself, well, and you say, mentally kicking herself for overlooking Lamb's talent for taking the straight and narrow and installing an Escher staircase, which was a wonderful sentence. So how would you describe their relationship as it's evolved through these books?
Oh, it would be hard to characterize at this stage, because they're two of the characters I do enjoy putting together in the same room, or at least more often on the same park bench, and seeing what happens. Because although they do spar all the time, I mean, there's almost always a duel going on between them, at least verbally. There is something there underneath that, some kind of mutual respect. They're both aware that the other is the only person I know who's more or less at their own speed, works at their own speed. So they do have a kind of respect which doesn't get in the way of them being quite ruthless when it comes to pursuing their own ambitions. I mean, Lamb doesn't really have ambitions beyond wanting everything to stay the way it is. Taverner will attempt to use Lamb, has attempted to use Lamb on occasion, and generally it either backfires or leaves her quite worried about how he might repay the compliment. So it's partly respect, partly hostility, but Lamb recognises what a difficult job it is that she does, And she suspects, wrongly, I think, that he would have liked in a different world to be where she is. You know, that he, at one point in his career, it's suggested he might have been heading, you know, on the fast track towards running the park himself. So there's that kind of suspicion operating there, as well as everything else. She doesn't really understand him. He does understand her. I think that's probably what it comes down to.
And this is one point where I might just leap out of your books and comment on the fact that there is a TV series based on the first novel in the series. And the depiction, for me as a reader, the depiction of Diana Taverner and of Jackson Lamb on the TV series is just spectacular. But these are your creations. So what does it mean to you to see these creations embodied on a screen? What do you think when you see them?
And what I think is that I couldn't have been luckier. I mean, you've got Gary Oldman and Christian Scott Thomas playing these two people, and you know, you could have them reading the phone book at each other, and it would be mesmerising. It's quite. I've been extraordinarily lucky in the casting throughout, but certainly with those two actors, both of whom are, you know, two of the finest character actors on the planet, then what could go wrong? He said, touching wood. It's a huge thrill to me, because the TV series in which I've been involved at a couple of levels, but not. I haven't done any of the writing. I haven't written the scripts. The writers involved have done their utmost to bring the characters to the screen as they're being portrayed in the books. And the actors have done exactly the same thing. Almost all of the actors have been reading the novels. I think it's quite rare to have an adaptation where so much has been done to retain the mood and the tone of the source material. Quite often when a book is adapted for TV, it's used as a springboard, really, for the TV writers and producers and so on, to bring their own ideas into play and to create a different version of what's going on in the book. There are times in Slough Horses and in the books that are in the TV versions that are to come, where, you know, we depart from the original plot a bit. But what matters is that the characters are always very much as I created them, and therefore instantly recognizable to readers of the books, and that's a huge thrill to me. So it's very exciting to watch.
And also the feel, the tone, the look of it, that building and the sort of yellow grey light in this sort of tawdry office building is just really, really something else. But you know, these novels are funny. They're also poetic. I think you like an extended metaphor. I mean, like the behind the scenes idea, the references to theatre that I refer to in that very opening section that I read from. There's another whole section that is about the moisture in London and the wetness. So there's that side of writing. But I actually want to ask you about the way that you write action, because it feels to me as a reader like you're sort of making commentary on some of the sort of popular culture versions of spy stories and thrillers and people running around and doing high kicks and having ridiculous fights, because there's this extended section in this latest novel where some of the fight scenes became almost ludicrous in the action of people getting run over and things going wrong and people falling out of windows. And it just became really wild. And it felt like you were commenting on the way in which pop culture spy stories and thrillers work. Were you?
Partly. I'm having fun, to be honest. I always think of these scenes as being the running and jumping scenes. And because I'm writing thrillers, there has to be some of that. You have to put action sequences in. What I really like to do is set myself a challenge of some sort. I occasionally do workshops in how to write thriller fiction. One of the things I would say about writing action sequences or creating suspense is it's in the editing. You cut away a lot. You create a scene of some tension and then you move to something else and then return to it and then go away again. And you keep setting up these little cliffhangers so that ideally the reader is on the edge of their seat. So when it came to writing bad actors, I thought, well, as a challenge, I'm going to do exactly the opposite of that. And there's an extended flashback sequence, as you say, in the middle of the book, where I didn't do any cutaways at all. So it's 20,000 words or so of unbroken prose in which the point of view changes from one character to the other. And all the action, well, most of the action in the book is in that scene, is in that towards the end of that scene. So I wanted to create an action scene where the camera never moves away, as it were, once I decided I was going to call this book Bad Actors, I knew that I was going to be using a lot of theatrical imagery and cinematic imagery and televisual and so on. And Roddy Hoetis, I think, regards this particular scene as being the one-shot movie. You know, it all happens in one take without stopping. I just wanted to move the camera around without actually having any edits in it. So I suppose in a way that is commenting on how it works in cinema, or one version of it. But really, I'm just having fun with how it works on the page. I don't have a particularly visual imagination, I don't think. Initially, all of my creative urges come from the written word. It's from vocabulary. It's from creating paragraphs. It's from working with sentences, and playing with the images that come to mind. So it's nice to think that it operates as a commentary on these larger issues, but what it comes down to in the end is I'm having fun on the page. And
I was having so much fun reading, particularly actually when it came to the character of Shirley Dander, another of the slow horses, a bit bonkers, taking too much cocaine, going totally berserk at times, running around holding an iron, which for some reason I found terribly funny. And she somehow ends up in a knife fight with someone, and all she has is a piece of plastic cutlery, a spork to be precise. So I felt like I was laughing amidst the adrenaline. Can you, and I don't think it's actually giving anything away, because if you're reading the book, you'll have no idea that this scene is coming for you, I promise. But tell us about Shirley.
I like the idea that you think Shirley takes too much cocaine. There's probably an ideal version of Shirley who takes exactly the right amount of cocaine.
She thinks she takes enough, or maybe she should take more.
Shirley's there for in Slough House largely for anger management issues, and although she is she's a grand character to write for comedic purposes, because she does tend to get into a lot of trouble, she's actually quite deeply feeling as well. She is the character who most often broods on the colleagues that are no longer there, because characters do die in my books. And she's the one who doesn't really get over that quite so swiftly as some of the others. She's constantly missing those whom she formed friendships with. Yes, she does get into a lot of trouble in this particular book, because it starts off in this book, she's essentially in a rehab facility, a service-run rehab facility, which she is not enjoying at all. And she's always eager for a fight, essentially, whether that fight is an actual physical fight or just, you know, a row with the nearest person. So she's a good person to bottle up, because it will always create a lot of angst within her, and she tends to express herself quite dramatically under such circumstances. But as with a lot of this particular book, the trigger for that particular scene you mentioned was a scene from a movie. I've buried a lot of famous movie lines in the book, particularly in the last section. There are 12, 15 last lines of movies in the last 5 or 6 pages of the book. But there's a scene in the movie The Untouchables, which I'm sure many of you will know, where Sean Connery says something about never bring a knife to a gunfight. So I just adapted that line, never bring a spork to a knife fight, and I gave that to Shirley. So it was that line allowed me to create the whole scene in which she is having a fight using only a piece of plastic cutlery.
But as well as lines from movies, there are lines from, or references, I think, to other pieces of literature and to poetry embedded in there too, isn't there? In your writing?
There's often lines of verse in what I write, because like most writers, well, most of us in general, you know, I have a whole grab bag of stuff in my head, which is what I use to express myself. And I've always read a lot of verse, and verse by its very nature tends to be more memorable than prose. So lines of poetry come into my mind when I'm writing. I don't sort of go looking for them, you know. I don't scrabble around my shelves thinking, oh, can I drop some well-known line in here? You know, I only use what's in my head, as it were. And sometimes that comes out as actual quotations. Other times it's more oblique references to other works, but usually verse. Bad Actors starts with a line from Robert Frost. It's "The woods are lovely, dark and deep. Only my particular woods are lovely, dark and deep, and full of noisy bastards." So it was that balance between the lyrical, the Frost line, and the bordering on the profane, which is where my imagination often lurks.
Can we go back to Shirley? Now, as you said, she feels very deeply the loss of her colleagues. As a writer, how do you feel about killing off your characters, literally killing off your darlings that you've created?
It's not something I ever do lightly, and it's not something I ever do on the spur of the moment. I never stop in the middle of a book and think, I know how I could spice things up. I could kill one of these characters off. I don't tend to plan books in any great detail because I think largely that's futile, the kind of books I'm writing. There are too many characters to be able to do that. And I can never foresee all the, the different kind of situations that are going to arise that I need to respond to as a writer within the book. So what I have is a set of situations that I know are going to occur. And the plot is basically a matter of providing the context in which that can, the particular situation can be brought about. So if a character is going to die, that's always going to be one of those situations. I spoke before about how my imagination was mostly triggered by vocabulary and by words, but there's one novel, Joe Country, which the initial spur to write it was something visual. I just had an image in my head of, it was a very Chaucerian sort of image, a snow-covered field with a tree in it and the character sitting under that tree. And I knew who that character was. It was one of my regulars, and I knew that they were dead. So creating the plot of Joe Country was simply a matter of moving towards that scene from my usual beginning. I always know where I'm starting because I'm always in Slough House with all these characters. So the creation of the plot was simply to allow that scene to take place. How I feel about killing them, I only do it, because the particular book demands it, as far as I'm concerned. Some of them I do miss. I mean, I don't regard my characters as being real in any sense. But when I'm writing, because I'm writing from the point of view of each individual character, that means they each have their own, to my mind, individual voice. They have their own way of seeing things. They have their own thoughts and feelings. They have their own traumas that they're coping with. So there are one or two characters that I've killed off. I miss them because I no longer have access to that point of view. I no longer have that voice to work with. It's been closed off to me. So it's a loss to me, but I hope it's a loss to readers as well. I mean, I think it's books resonate more when if the reader is emotionally engaged with them and takes a loss away with them afterwards. If they something to grieve over means that there's an emotional impact that a book has had, and I quite like that.
Well, they have such an emotional impact, but also an intellectual one, because there are puzzles and complexities in your book and things that you're thinking about. And one of the things, and this is a bit of a segue away, I'd like to talk about Russia, because in this latest novel, Russia features, and it used to be said that the end of the Cold War was hard for writers of spy fiction. And in fact, you do have one character think to himself, the Cold War wasn't all muffins at Checkpoint Charlie, which is another line that made me laugh. So was it a hard decision to decide? I'm curious about why you decided to look to Russia.
So I'll just say that particular line was partly a tribute to another writer, Brian Fremantle, who had a character called Charlie Muffin in his Cold War Furnace. Because then in a much earlier book, I make a reference to the idea of the Cold War being the natural state of affairs. This is a discussion between two old Cold War warriors, really, Lamb and an old Russian, his equivalent, I suppose. And I partly feel that as a writer of spy fiction, that is true. I think that the Cold War produced all the great classics of the spy novel, which were only really written during the Cold War. I mean, I think that the great spy fiction probably finished around about 1990. But nevertheless, the Cold War, obviously, we all know, is kind of coming back, and perhaps a lot slightly warmer than we would like it to be. So the old lines are being drawn once again. The walls are going up in different places, and we all know about walls that were intended to go up and hopefully won't ever. Thinking about the United States there. But that kind of battleground, if you like, a sort of metaphorical battleground, currently a real life battleground in Ukraine, as we all know, is one that allows writers of spy fiction to it's like having the chessboard there in front of you. We know who the opposing sides are again, and it allows us to draw on the whole history and traditions of the genre. I'm struggling a bit with this because partly I don't really know. I do know that in my own, whatever passes for a spy writer's heart, I do feel that the Cold War is what spy fiction ought to be about. And so there's a yearning there to do that. And in Dead Lions, which was my kind of Cold War novel in a way, all the main characters are looking back on those actual days of the Cold War and dealing with the consequences of actions undertaken during that time. As we get further away from it historically, and other, Russia comes to take on a different guise. I mean, currently it's a bandit state run by a psychopath, and this is not quite what it was in the Cold War days, but nevertheless, as a kind of global menace, which is very obviously interfering in world affairs in underhand ways, interfering with elections and the like, as well as invading neighbouring states. It's the obvious big bad villain to use, I suppose.
Yes, and it's interesting because crime fiction often feels so very, very present. And I was aware that we were reading a book that was set when COVID had been going on for a while, but it was clearly set just before the invasion of Ukraine. But it almost feels like it's sitting there in your novel at the end of the pages. But that whole Cold War spy fiction question, do you then feel as a writer that you're sort of writing in some sort of conversation to writers like Le Carré?
Partly, yes, because I think all fiction or writing should be a part of a dialogue rather than a monologue. So being aware of other writers in the field and what they've been capable of, and conversing with them in a way, is a necessary part of creating a fiction. I think a writer who wasn't doing that would probably be in danger of simply talking to themselves after a while, I think.
And I've got a bit excited here about just talking to you when, of course, we have a whole audience who has questions that they are likely to want to ask as well. So for people who are watching, leap onto the Q&A button and start writing your questions, because we're very keen to hear them and Mick will answer them. And so I will just throw in one as you're writing. And of course, if people are too shy, I will just keep asking you questions, Mick, because I have many. Look, all these convoluted political machinations, plot and counterplot, international conspiracies, as well as common or garden variety thugs, they're all held together by these bitter and bored and disappointed trained spies who got it wrong. And I'm curious, I mean, as a reader, part of me wants to believe in this tawdry and crumpled version of espionage, but do you know much about how actual espionage work? I mean, does that interest you? The relationship of what you write to what actually happens?
Less than it ought to, I think, is probably the answer. I'm writing a fiction, a series of fictions in which the characters are, to me, the most important part, the most important element. And I've created a situation in which these characters are stuck in order to, simply in order to write about it. How that relates to the real world and what how intelligence services actually operate doesn't really matter to me very much. I don't research the intelligence service. All that I know about them tends to come from fiction, whether mostly books, but also, TV and movies as well. And that's the world in which I'm operating. It's the world of make-believe. I hope that what I write is in no way an accurate reflection of how things really go on. I suspect in some ways it probably is, because, as I say, I focus on the human, and the human element is something that's always going to be there. But I honestly believe in my heart that the intelligence service is a lot more efficient and a lot more successful than I portray it to be.
And hopefully perhaps not quite as ruthless.
I'm sorry?
And perhaps not quite as ruthless. Now, look, Alexandra...
I think possibly more ruthless, and ruthless in a way that means we never get to find out about it. I think that the main issue that the intelligence service must have with its public image is that when it's successful, we never know about it. We don't know about the successes. We only know about the failures. And so that's what gets focused on to a far greater degree than is writing proper, I think. The very fact that we don't have alarms and emergencies going on every day is, I'm sure, in large part due to the work that they do.
And I'm just going to leap in because somebody has asked me to clarify the name of your latest book, which is Bad Actors. But Alexandra has asked, how do you write such political points while not stepping on real toes?
I have no idea the degree to which I do or do not step on toes. I think I don't really pay much and possibly enough attention to that. I don't do social media, I'm not on Twitter or Facebook or anything. So I'm writing inside a very small bubble, really, when I'm writing any kind of political commentary. And I'm simply, by and large, expressing my own thoughts and feelings on the matter. To be fair, I do allow characters to express opinions that aren't my own, so other points of view are heard within the books. But again, it comes down to what's happening on the page. I'm focused on that and not on the effect that page is going to have when it's published. That's when I start to worry about it. When I'm actually writing, I don't worry about it at all.
Yes, because that's when a book turns into something else as readers read it. Now, Lloyd says, am I correct in recollecting that you said location accuracy is irrelevant? And related to this, is it, in your view, acceptable to mix the real with the imagined?
I don't necessarily think it's irrelevant. I overstated if I said that. I do use real locations quite often in the books, generally around the same area where I used to work, which is where I put Slough House. And so I use the immediate environs, and I do describe them as accurately as I'm capable of. But if I needed, an office building to be in a place where it isn't, in Dead Lions, I have a building which is loosely based on the Shard, but it's not where the Shard is. Then I just go ahead and do that. I have a building in my London called the Needle, which it's in the Shard, only it's on the other side of the river. I mean, it is the Shard, but somewhere else. So I feel quite happy about inventing places if need be. How that came about was that I had been writing. I was towards the end of Dead Lions. I had written, about this office block where a lot of the action takes place. And while I was writing it on a daily basis, I could see the Shard going up in the background from near where my office was, and I realised that actually that was going to be the biggest building in London, and therefore I ought to borrow its statistics. So I Googled the Shard, and then I matched my imaginary building to fit it. I made it the same height. I gave it the same kind of, broadly speaking, I gave it the same kind of specs. So I just stole the Shard and put it somewhere else, essentially. So it's a mixture of the imaginary and the real.
So like all writers, you're the god of your own world.
That's a good way of putting it.
Now, somebody watching from Kenmore Library has asked about the TV series, which is on Apple TV, if people are wondering what we're talking about. And they wanted to know how much time and involvement in the creation influenced... I'm slightly misreading this. How much time and involvement in the creation influenced the movie elements is referenced in Bad Actors.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, the title Bad Actors had been with me for a while. I tend to bury titles in previous books, and when I have a title, I'll put it in the text, and then a few books down the line, I'll take it out and use it. So Spook Street was referenced in Real Tigers, and London Rules is a phrase I've been using for a while. Bad Actors is a phrase that's been around for a few books, and it's pure coincidence that the book came out at the same time as the TV series did. But because I had been involved in the TV show, and I'd been on set a time or two and had been in the writer's room, I picked up a lot of terms and bits of information and observations that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So it certainly added to the flavours of the novel.
Well, that phrase, bad actors, I mean, one of the characters says at a particularly crucial point in the plot, she says she's thinking about doing what needs to be done. You played the part you were given. It was never in her to be a bad actor. And I think the phrase actually appears more than once in the book. So it means different things, I think, to different people. Would that be right?
I think so, yes. I mean, people approach phrases and so on from their own points of view. I mean, it all comes down to empathizing with individual characters, and they're all going to have their own outlook on things and how things are. So the phrase becomes a movable feast, I suppose, in that sense. Yeah.
How much is this a world that you want to stay in? I mean, will there be more? I mean, it certainly feels at the end of Bad Actors that we can keep opening that hard to open door and keep clumping up those stairs. Will
Oh yes,
you keep
there'll be more
clumping
to
up those
come.
stairs?
I will. I'm writing something different at the moment, but it's set in the same or a very similar world. There's a certain degree of overlap going on, but it's not a Slough House book. There will be another one though. Once I've finished this, I will go back to that hard to open door and go up the grubby old staircase again. Yeah. I'm already looking forward to it.
What's the relationship, do you think, between your work as a poet, because I think you started out as a poet, and as a novelist?
I never think of myself as a poet anymore. I'm a failed poet or an ex-poet. But writing verse is a huge benefit when you're trying to write prose, because it teaches you not only the weight of individual words, but the weight and importance of individual syllables. I'm a writer for whom rhythm matters a great deal, both in the sense of in the dialogue sense, you want to get a good rhythm going when characters are talking to each other, but also in the broader sense of knowing when to return to a particular point and how paragraphs are formed and so on. And I think most of my views on what's the right way to write are based on having written verse, writing a line at a time, and each word and each syllable having its own place and being justifiable. It helps when I'm doing the sort of self-editing process of reading through the drafts and thinking, what can I take out? Because that's always the most important part of the rewriting. It's, now I've written all this, what can I get rid of? Anything that doesn't do its work can just go. And that's when knowing that a sentence is just slightly too long, when it goes on a bit too long, really helps. And I think having been a poet and having been a sub-editor in my professional career, both have really fed into the way that I write.
I'm interested in how much you actually grapple with the style of the book, because it does feel like we're moving, as readers, that we're moving through different voices in the book, because at times there's almost this sort of intimate voice saying, come with me, step through these stairs. And that voice is both intimate and, well, and I guess quite poetic in these sort of extended descriptions. And then we have the voice that's taking us into character. And how much do you grapple as a writer and rework your style and the shape of your book and the voice that you want? Voices.
Oh, a lot. I mean, a lot of writing is about rewriting, and it's always a grapple. I mean, it never gets any easier. I'm glad it doesn't. I mean, it's something I find writing a joy. There are a lot of joys in it, but it's also hard work. It's difficult, and so it ought to be. The narrative voice that is that kind of more lyrical, descriptive one, where the big words come into play. That's as much a character as any of the slow horses themselves. I think it's not my own voice; it's the voice I use when I'm writing those bits. But it's that particular character has been around right from the first pages of Slow Horses, and it's the voice that I lean on when I'm writing these books. It's different from the voices that I've used in writing other kinds of fiction, but it's become to feel more natural to me than any other narrative voice that I've used. But it does rely on the lyrical, and it does rely on the poetic, and I do reach for the more abstruse pieces of vocabulary in those scenes, which don't come into play when I'm writing dialogue, for instance.
It is a very beguiling, a very interesting voice, that voice, and it really stands out from in Bad Actors, we have a little odd scene in a woods with some football thugs, and then we get that voice. You said that you teach workshops and teach people about...
Very occasionally.
But how then would you describe this lyrical voice?
Oh, I don't know. One that's not afraid to use more outre vocabulary, if you like. One that trusts the reader. I mean, I trust that my readers are going to stay with me during those bits and find the pleasure in them. I love playing with words, and if I'm writing for anybody other than myself, then I'm writing for people who have find that similar pleasure in language. What I like is finding humour in words that hadn't been apparent to me before. Using them either because I'm bringing them together in a way that's new to me, or just finding an aspect of the language where the language bestows a gift, really. This all sounds a bit abstract. I'll give you an example. When I was writing, I think it's in London Rules, I have a description of Jackson Lamb. Now, we've talked about his flatulence now, his capacity for farting. And I describe that capacity as being bottomless, a bottomless capacity for farting. Now, that's not me being a comedic genius. That's the English language showing what it can do. The fact that you can use that word bottomless in that context, to me, was an absolute delight. So those kinds of things, when I find things like that, that gives me great pleasure. And I write for people who have a similar appreciation for the way that the language works.
Well, given so many people are here, I think knowing the Slough House books, and one of our attendees has said they love the Slough Horses books, but wonder which of your other novels, you want to introduce us to, or other favourites, he said.
I think in many ways the one I'm proudest of is a standalone called This Is What Happened, which is different, very different from these Slough House books. It's very, very slightly based on a real incident that happened a long, long time ago. I'd read a reference to it in a newspaper, and it must have stayed in the back of my head for more than a decade before I found a way of using it in fiction. Can't tell you what that is because that's a big spoiler for the plot. It's much shorter than the other books, and it only has 3 main characters in it, 3 main voices. And because of that, I was able to plot it in a way that I don't usually do so. So when I sat down to write that book, I knew what was going to happen in every scene before I started writing, except for the very end, which I allowed to develop organically. And for that reason, it was perhaps the book I found easiest to write, because I could simply concentrate on expressing myself rather than worrying about what was going to happen next. It was a notebook is a total pleasure to write. There's always difficult bits, but it was the least painful book to write, and one that I feel very proud of. This is what happened.
This is what happened. And of course, the good thing about this latest edition, Bad Actors, is that it does list all of your books, or hopefully it has all of your books listed in the front if people want more. Mick Herron, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you tonight.
Me too, Kate.
This morning for you. Thank you so much. And I think Catherine's about to come back.
Yes, when you see me, you know I'm going to say something. Thank you so much to both of you. I'm so pleased that you talked about the poetry and the humour, because they are incredibly strong, and also the unconventional narrative, the fact that you don't give us cheap thrills. You give us plenty of thrills, but they're not cheap, and they're not they're not feel good in a sentimental way, but yeah, there are moments of wonderful sentiment. And I'm left wanting to go back to the beginning and read all the books again, which is rare actually, and is a fantastic thing. So thank you so much. And I will read that non-Slough House book that you mentioned. It's good to know. It's good to have something different to look at. We've come to the end of this evening, and we've also come to the end of our international festival. It's been a great month and a great ending to that month. And in September, we'll have our face-to-face festival. Mick, I hope one day you'll be able to get here, where we live in hope.
I hope so.
We absolutely live in hope. But next month, July and August, we'll have more online events, but we're really hanging out for September to see people, a lot of people properly, without the worry and the panic of all that nasty COVID stuff. And you seem to be coping quite well in the UK. There's lots of live things happening, so we can do it. Good. Thank you so much again. And
thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Kate. That was wonderful.
Thank you. I enjoyed it so much.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you for watching. Bye.